Namaskar and welcome back to a very special episode of Samvaad. Today we welcome back Dr. Salvatore Babones on special demand. Dr. Babones joins us today just for answering your questions. Dr. Babones, it is a pleasure again to welcome you to Samvaad. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Thank you, sir. Without further ado, sir, we'll start with our questions. The first questions that we have is from Shrish. He asked your thought on the recent BBC documentary on Prime Minister Modi. What is the agenda and what are your thoughts on that?
I haven't seen the documentary. It's blocked in Australia with a very aggressive geo-blocking that catches even my VPN. So I haven't been able to actually watch the documentary. That said, it's clear to me that the timing of the documentary strongly indicates that it has to do much more with Rishi Sunak in the UK than with Narendra Modi in India. If the intent were anti-Modi, it would have been released in 2014, in 2019, or it would have been held off till 2024. Instead, it seems clear that the underlying data breach, that is the underlying leak from the British Foreign Office on which the documentary is entirely based. I mean, no leak of the 2002 report, no documentary. Let's face it. That leak seems to have occurred right around September 2022. That is, if you backdate how long it takes to do the interviews. On top of that, I had let me just say an account that is someone who knew someone who was interviewed for the documentary, said the interview occurred in October 2022, which strongly indicates they got the leak in September. They assembled a group of experts in October, and then they did all the putting together, the editing, the production to release the documentary in early 2023. So I'm sure this documentary has much more to do with the fact that the UK has its first Hindu prime minister than it does anything to do with Narendra Modi.
Right, sir. So Ram asks your opinion on the recent Hindenburg controversy and the stock dip of Adani Industries. Do you think this as an attack on India's financial sovereignty?
No, it's an effort by an American short seller to make money. Look, Hindenburg's a hedge fund. The key to them is right in the name, Hindenburg, which is a reference to a German blimp that crashed in New Jersey 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And crashed and burned. And their whole model is getting companies to crash and burn. They identify companies they believe are overvalued. Let's face it, Adani stock had risen dramatically in the past year. And that probably resulted in overvalued and thus vulnerable stock. Hindenburg pulled together all sorts of information and its own analysis, just put together a report that said, we believe this. I mean, if you cut to the chase, what the report fundamentally says, leave aside all the unproven allegations, all of the innuendo. Really, all it says is we believe Adani's overvalued. And what happened? It popped the bubble in Adani stock. And remember, Adani stock only went back to where it was 1 year ago. Right. So all the profits that were made by people who'd invested in Adani, including the Indian state insurer, all of that, really, people just went back to where they were in February 2022. With their Adani investments. All the lost value just brought it back to there. So it's not such a big deal. Of course, it's a big deal if your name is Gautam Adani. There's no doubt about it. And it's a big deal if you invested in Adani a year ago and then saw all of your gains destroyed. Or certainly if you invested at the top of the market in January 2023, it would be a catastrophe for you. But it says very little about Indian capitalism. It says very little about the health of Adani's enterprises. It seems, again, I'm speaking as I'm not a financial analyst, but it seems as if the Adani enterprises are on a firm financial footing. The experts seem to believe that it is. I am not an expert in that area. I want to be very clear. Look, this was just a hit job by a short selling hedge fund, and they made a ton of money.
Right, sir. So moving forward, we have a question from Kashyap on the Khalistan issue. He asks your views on this issue playing out in specifically Anglophone countries. I think US, UK, Australia. So do you think that the Khalistani elements, they have the support of the government there, or do you think that they're operating independently?
Certainly they're independent. This is a civil society movement among diaspora Sikhs. Now, in Canada specifically, diaspora Sikhs have become a major electoral community, what Indians would call a vote bank. And they're a vote bank for the party that's currently in government, the Liberal Party of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So as a result, the Khalistani movement maybe has some additional protection in Canada. That is, it has some additional security against government interference. That said, the Anglo-American countries are all countries with free and open institutions. I've thought it's bizarre when I've heard Indians say that they thought that Anthony Albanese in Australia was committed to suppressing the Khalistan referendums. No such thing. All he said was all of Australia's laws against violence apply to the Khalistan movement just like they do to any other movement. And of course, it was against the law for Khalistani activists to deface temples in India. That's a hate crime in Australia, and I'm sure is being investigated. But there's no reason to expect Western governments to take any position on this. These are their own, in most cases, their own citizens who are protesting, as is their right to protest. And whether you agree or disagree with their cause, as long as they don't get involved in violence, as long as they don't get involved in terrorist finance, there's no reason to expect Western governments to do anything about it. Now, I've heard lots of rumors that there is terrorist financing, especially from Canada, to the Khalistan terrorist movement, which is a very small movement in Punjab in India. If that's true, then we should expect Canadian law enforcement cooperation. And that's where the primary concern comes in. If the embeddedness of Khalistani Sikhs within the Liberal Party in Canada prevents Canada from fully investigating potential terrorist financing, that would be a concern, but all of that is conjectural. I just have no information on Canadian law enforcement.
Right, sir. Sir, Arun asks, Professor, what are your views on the woke culture and how will you define woke culture in your own words?
Sorry, what culture?
Woke
culture.
Yes.
Look, wokeness is an extreme form of virtue signaling. The journalist James Bartholomew coined the term virtue signaling in Spectator magazine, I think 5 or 6 years ago. And wokeness is just extreme virtue signaling. That is, it's what we call a Calvinistic form of post-religious social signaling. Now, in Calvinism, there was the idea. John Calvin was a Protestant preacher in the 16th, 17th century in Geneva in Switzerland. And the Calvinist theory was that the elect, that is, people who are going to be going to heaven, those who are well-behaved, must, of course, already be known to God, because God is omniscient. And therefore, there's a group of people among us who are the godly, who are going to be going to heaven. And we may not know who they are, but they've already been selected. And an implication of that is, of course, if you live in a Calvinist community, like 16th century Geneva, you want everyone to think you're one of the elect. Right? Everyone wants to be among the elect. And this phenomenon, this very Calvinist Protestant phenomenon, has become de-associated from its religious foundations. So Harvard University, for example, was founded by Calvinists. The Pilgrims who founded the Massachusetts colony in America in the 17th century were dedicated Calvinists. Harvard University was the first Calvinist university in the world. It was founded to be a Calvinist university. So even though today people at Harvard generally are atheist, even militantly atheist, that Calvinist culture remains of people signaling that, they are we have the expression in English, holier than thou, that these are the holiest of holy people. And so when you embrace a certain set of ideologies, and those ideologies are always changing. It's, right now, I'd say there are 3 things that identify you as woke in Australia: embracing a pro-Indigenous agenda, embracing a pro-transsexual or LGBTQIA plus agenda, and embracing a anti-global warming, anti-carbon agenda. And those identifiers are woke. But in the US, they're different. In the US, indigeneity is not so important for wokeness. It's racism. Embracing anti-racism is what makes you woke. And in different countries, in different social milieu, you might have different conditions. But sociologically speaking, it all comes from this Calvinist strain in Anglo-American culture. That's why you don't find a lot of wokeness in Catholic Europe. You look very hard to find Spanish or Italian or Latin American wokeness, right? Wokeness is very much a phenomenon, not just of Protestant European cultures, but specifically of Calvinist Protestant European cultures. So specifically people who are, not so much Church of England, not so much Catholic, but specifically Protestant Calvinist culture. I'll just give one final example. In the United States, the entire south of the United States, most religious areas tend to be Baptist. The Baptist Protestants are not Calvinist. They have a different theology. And so you have very little wokeness in the South. Whereas in New England, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, where Calvinist Protestantism used to reign supreme, that's where you see all these signs on everybody's lawn listing all the causes they embrace, even now to embracing Ukraine. Right? Like, so, what is it that makes you woke for believing in Vladimir Zelensky? Well, it's just part of the group of things you must now embrace in order to be among the elect.
Right, sir. Sir, we have a question by Arnab, and it's kind of very interesting. He asks, towards the end of century, who do you think will emerge as a superpower? Will it be India? Will it be China? Or US will be able to retain its position?
U.S. dominance is here to stay and will be with us for a couple centuries. This is something I've studied and something I've actually written a couple books about. That said, U.S. dominance occurs in partnership with other countries, and I think the primary partner for the U.S. is likely to shift from being the European Union and Western Europe in general, to being India. I think that's the most likely outcome, that India will become the second pillar of the liberal democratic world. Now, I can't say that for certain that India will go that direction, but it's my instinct that that's how the evolution will occur. Whether India does or does not take this approach, U.S. dominance is already baked into the world, not just for now, but probably for the 22nd century as well. And that's because of American centrality in global networks. It's not just the sheer size of the U.S. economy. It's the fact that global networks are focused on the U.S. I mean, even this Zoom call is likely passing through a U.S. server, because we're connecting from Australia to India. That's going via the United States. So centrality networks is something that's very sticky. The UK remained a global hegemon right until the rise of the U.S. So right up until the end of World War I, and even today, the UK has become a sub-hegemon under the U.S. If you think about it, global currency trading is still based in London. Why is global currency trading based in London? Because those networks are so sticky. The internet is likely to remain centered on the United States, even after we have something that replaces the internet. If you look at things like stock market capitalization, something like over 80% of global stock market capitalization is in the United States, right? I mean, it's just the network externalities of joining this US centered network are so strong that even after the relative dominance of the United States disappears, the network effects will remain. And that relative dominance is not disappearing anytime soon. I mean, the countries that are even close to approaching the US in GDP, total GDP, China, well, European Union is now declining relative to the US, but China and India, which are coming closer to US levels. If you use PPP-based measures, you might even say China is larger than the US. They're still much, much poorer than the US. And the fact that China in particular has closed systems means that China will never be the center of global networks because its networks are closed. So US dominance is here rest of the century, and I would take a bet on the 2200s as well. Right, so 22nd century as well. Yeah.
Right. We have a question from a username @M96. So he asks about your views on the recent visit of the Australian Prime Minister, and he further asks, do you think India and Australia relation has a future outside the Quad?
So I'm an American who lives in Australia. So obviously, I follow Australian politics and events relatively closely. Australia's connection to India is, I can summarize it in 4 letters. That's COAL. It's all about coal exports to India. The Quad is important, but not very important. The Quad is really much more important as a U.S.-centered security alignment. Australia-India relations are overwhelmingly about the export of natural resources from Australia to India, and then secondarily about the import of Indian students, and then later on skilled employees, after they're finished with their student years, to Australia. So it's about immigration, natural resources and immigration. Those are not going to go away. There's very strong support in Australia strong bipartisan, overwhelming support for close relations with India. In fact, the Liberal government that lost office last year had announced a $24 million endowment for a National Center for Australia-India Relations to promote improved people-to-people ties and investment ties between Australia and India. The Labor government that came in, you'd think new government comes in, they overturn. No, one of their first actions was to say, we're continuing this policy. And in fact, that center is now being created. So it's a strong bipartisan, all parts of society supported effort to retain strong Australia-India relations, but they're entirely based on Australian exports of raw materials and Australian imports of Indian talent.
Right, sir. So we have another question from Kashyap. He asks that there have been reports of China buying large amounts of land in Australia, and there also have been reports of Chinese students in Australian campuses furthering the agenda of CCP. So what are your views on that?
The land purchases are worrying, and they're even more worrying in the United States, where Chinese companies have been buying land in proximity to sensitive U.S. military installations. And in fact, the purchases in Australia that have been controversial because they are close to U.S. military installations in Australia. So the Chinese land purchases in Australia, I think, are much more about U.S.-China rivalry than about Australia as such. Now, as for influence on campus, Chinese influence on campus, I actually just published a book about that last year. End of 2021, December 2021, called Australia's Universities, Can They Reform? And there's an entire chapter in that book on Chinese influence. It doesn't actually operate through students. And that may seem very unlikely to the uninitiated, but in fact, Chinese influence at Australian universities operates primarily via research connections. And it's very subtle and a bit underground. But in fact, my chapter on Chinese influence in Australian institutions was published as an article by Quadrant Magazine, the chapter in the book. So after this, once this goes live and we tweet out about this interview, I'll then, under that, I will place the article. So if people want to read about the real routes to Chinese influence in Australia, they can get the inside scoop on it.
Right, sir. So we have a final question, and it is a bit light-hearted question from Muji Pepe, and he's asking one place you can permanently shift to India. If you were to shift to India, which would that place be, and why?
I haven't traveled around India very much, to be honest. I've only been to India twice, and so the only places I've been are Mumbai, Delhi, Noida, Lucknow, Varanasi, and Mangalore. So there you go. One hand, or maybe that's a hand and a finger. I lost count. Is everywhere I've ever been in India. So honestly, I just don't know. I assume that, simply based on meteorology, it sounds like Bangalore is the best place. Has the best weather and the clearest skies and all of that. So. Bangalore, it would probably be just because I don't want to breathe the pollution in Delhi. That's for sure.
Well, so that's very correct. Correct assumption about Bangalore. We had more than 300 questions, and it was very difficult to accommodate a lot of questions in this small interview space. And there were some overlaps as well, so we have taken that into account as well. So we would just like to thank you again for your time. Because you came again, especially for our viewers. And so that is a very kind gesture from your end. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for setting up the session.
Thank you so much, sir. So I'll bid your adieu, and hope, sir, we can arrange another interview in the near future. Thank you so much for coming on Samvaad, sir.
I
Namaskar.
look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.